Hey, hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed that little break. We're gonna get right back into our next and final session for today. We just had an amazing session with Dr. Ramzi Baroud that was very validating actually for a lot of us who have been in organizing spaces where Palestinian voices aren't centered. And so I think this is a perfect transition into our conversation about healing and trauma and all of the things that we feel and we face when thinking about and organizing around Palestinian liberation. So I'm very excited for this. I just want to welcome everyone back, just get back situated into hearing and learning. And it's my pleasure to pass the virtual mic to a PACC family member and community member, one of our favorites, Basma Bsharat, who's going to introduce both of our speakers and moderate the panel for today.
Thank you, Abir, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Basma Bishrat, and I'm so excited to be presenting today's session titled Collective Healing in the Diaspora. As a first-generation Palestinian American myself, who grew up in the diaspora, I've always felt the impact of being both Palestinian and American, having spent summers in Palestine carrying a huwiyah, but knowing full well I would be leaving in just a matter of weeks or months. And it always left me in this strange space between the two. So I'm very excited to be a part of today's discussion, where we will be spending time exploring struggles such as intergenerational trauma, PTSD, and imposter syndrome, and more. Just some of the many struggles Palestinian Americans face today. So instead of brushing them aside, we must acknowledge, validate, and work on all of these struggles we have. That really have come down to decades of subtler colonialism and displacement. So we'll be working on destigmatizing these conversations surrounding mental health and making them a part of the activism that we do. Joining us for this wonderful conversation are Khadija Salim and Ranim Kurzum. Khadija is a Palestinian American licensed professional counselor specializing in trauma. She is currently a counseling psychology doctoral student with research interests surrounding intergenerational trauma in the Palestinian diaspora. She's passionate about decolonizing psychology, ancestral healing, and activism to promote healing in BIPOC communities. We also have Ranim Kurzum, a Palestinian American in Albany, New York. He is a second-year counseling psychology doctoral student at the University of Albany and has completed a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. Throughout his studies, Ranim developed a passion for and gained professional experience in immigration, trauma treatment, and Arab American psychology. So today, both Ranim and Khadija will be speaking for 40 minutes, and then we'll have a 20-minute Q&A conversation. Please feel free to type out your questions during the session, and we will get to them all at the end in the order that they will be received. So let's get started.
All right, marhaba everyone. I'm glad to be sharing this virtual space with you all. And our talk today is titled Collective Healing in the Diaspora. And Basma, thank you for introducing us. It's much appreciated. So today we'll be talking about several different topics, many of which some of us might be familiar with and others which might include some new information. So the first portion of the talk will be focused on us presenting, sharing information about what we have and what we're bringing to the table. And then the second portion will be more of a question and answer, discussion-based time for all of us to come back together as a group and reflect on the experience. So during that first part, we're going to talk about mental health stigma, different types of trauma, the Arab experience compared to the Arab American experience, and resilience and healing. So during that time, feel free, comment in the chat if you wish, and we can come back together during that discussion-based format to reflect collectively. So first, we will start off with breaking stigma. So stigma, and that includes the discussion of the barriers to recognizing that there is a mental health concern, or the barriers to recognizing and seeking mental health services. The mental health stigma refers to the the negative attitudes and beliefs that others may have when it comes to talking about mental health, opening up about mental health, or exploring their own relationship with mental health. So this could look like a sense of fear to even consider that there may be a mental health concern, feelings or worries of being rejected or avoided if one brings up the topic of mental health or mental health services. And at the same time, it doesn't have to be something that one experiences outside of themselves. After hearing and seeing different forms of stigma, we can internalize that as our own. The thought that we ourselves may have room for growth in our mental well-being might be cause for concern or fear of avoidance of the topic because of this internalized stigma. To that, I would say that the culture around mental health is shifting. There's a lot more openness to talking about mental health, and that includes within the Arab American community. And this could mean more openness to exploring the topic on an individual level, more openness to exploring the topic with peers, or even seeking mental health services. So another barrier to seeking mental health services or talking about mental health concerns, that could include a culture of mistrust around mental health professionals. Like, are they really able to help us in some way that would be of benefit? Will they really understand us and our culture? Is there a disconnect between us and them? And to that, I would say there are a lot more resources now than there have been in the past that would be valuable to us who are interested in seeking services. So for example, there are a lot more Arab American providers now in the field. There are communities of Arab American providers and professionals who are coming together to put out more research, to study our experience as Arab Americans as it relates to mental health. And even among those who aren't Arab American, there's been a strong push in the field of professionals to look at cultural differences, a really important part of any type of therapeutic connection. There are a lot more providers now than there have in the past that value cultural competence in their work, or even cultural humility in recognizing what they do not know and what is really important to bring up in conversation with the people they're connecting with. So another potential barrier could be gender differences and the different roles and responsibilities that each person might hold within their community, within their family. So there could be different pressures and roles placed on men and women. So for example, for men, there could be this pressure to present oneself as strong, as well put together, as this stereotypically masculine person. One might think that identifying that they have a concern of emotions or thoughts is not stereotypically masculine enough, and they might be seen as weak. Women may also experience the pressure of holding up certain roles and responsibilities in their lives as well. And to that, I would say that recognizing mental health concerns or seeking mental health services when they would be of use does not mean automatically that we are weak individuals. If anything, talking about mental health care, seeking out mental health services when they're needed, helps us become the best version of ourselves when we need to be, so that we can successfully hold these different roles and responsibilities that we value to ourselves. But another barrier could be the way in which mental health is discussed in the States, and how that at times could conflict with some of what we're taught about mental health growing up. Now, while we could open up to this American way of understanding mental health with diagnoses and specific treatments, we could also look at mental health through an Arab American cultural lens. So this could look like using different terminology, using words in Arabic or words in English that are more suitable to us. This could mean identifying what works best for us in our cultural frame. And while therapy, in my opinion, has so much value, one can also find support in other areas, such as in religious settings, coming together as groups, such as what we're doing now in this conference, or last week during PACC Day. And if we're interested in speaking to someone confidentiality, finding an Arab American counselor who we feel comfortable speaking with is also an option. There may also be this fear that if we're going to bring up the topic of mental health or even seek mental health services, that the way others view us may change. This could be among friends, family members, in the workplace. We might have that voice in our mind in the background. It could have been like the voice of someone that we grew up and we heard, a friend, an uncle, an ammo, that when we bring up the topic of mental health, they'll just say, "Hada haba, this is not relevant, this is unimportant, we just tough it out." And to that, I would say that breaking down this stigma and opening up to talk about these topics, and it really helps empower us as a community. So all of us at some point in our lives have experienced some aspect of struggle within our mental well-being. Having or talking about mental health concerns does not make us lesser than or weaker than. And if we as a community can embrace this topic as more normal together, then we can heal and grow and tend to our soft spots together as a community as well. We can help build each other up together by supporting these types of conversations. So that we'll transition over to talking about different forms of trauma. And that'll be on this slide. So there have been some really great folks, Awad, Kia Keating, and Amir, who've created a framework to understand different forms of trauma among the Arab American community. And a lot of what I'll be talking about here is based on the work that they've put in on this topic. So when I talk about trauma, more specifically as it relates to some of these on the slide, it's often a form of trauma that's repetitive, that happens over and over and over again, rather than one single event. It's the accumulation of all of these things that we experience as historical trauma, or as the trauma of the national context. So I'll briefly talk about each one of these, and then after that, we'll transition over to Khadija, who will share a little bit with us in more depth about intergenerational trauma, or put another way, the transmission of these forms of trauma from one generation to the next. So on a more personal level, interpersonal discrimination, that is the way one person treating another person poorly is based on their social group that they belong to, and in this case, being Arab American. This could be in the form of racial insults, this could be social exclusion, this could be even physical harassment. And again, it's the accumulation of all of these incidences over time that I'm referring to. Trauma around the topic of identity and recognition. So what we're referring to here is the minimal recognition of us as Arabs here in the US. This could show up in the negative portrayal of us in the news, the media, the political rhetoric, or even in the international relationships between the states and our countries of origin. So we may be talked about as outsiders in the states, or our identity is not always recognized. So for an example of that could be, as we've all had to at some point check off a box to say what our race or ethnicity is, and we have to always decide, are we white, are we Caucasian, are we Asian, where do we fit in this? And there's not usually a box for us as Arab Americans that captures our experience in those moments. And again, like, these individually might seem like small little things, but it's the accumulation of all of them and the effect that those have on each of us as individuals. Then we'll move on to a more broader way of understanding trauma. And the first one being historical trauma. So historical trauma is this multi-generational, spanning across generations, this experience, and in this case, it's based on specific cultural, it's within a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. So this could be the major events that oppressed a particular group of people. So in one's home country, being repeatedly silenced on the political stage. This could mean exposure to violent conflict, or even seeing the others that one cares about exposed to violent conflict or threatened by violent conflict. And again, when I talk about violent conflict, I'm not limiting it to physical violence. It could be emotional violence. It could be spiritual violence, like, the desecration of religious sites. It could be cultural violence when we see another group taking what is a part of our culture and calling it their own. This could also mean, when I talk about historical trauma, it could be the potential trauma that arises from leaving one's homeland due to persecution or due to war, or whatever circumstances might have pushed someone away from where they came from. Historical trauma could also mean the fear that one carries for their friends or family members who are still in these types of circumstances that are not ideal. Then we'll move on to national context. So national context is, some examples of that could be national changes that happen after large events. So here in the States, that could have been after 9/11. And there could be a lot of changes in public policy, military responses, a change in public sentiment in the way that Arabs are talked about as a group, as a community here in the States. And that's oftentimes, a lot of it's fueled by the way the media covers the different topics that we are in some capacity indirectly involved with. So it could mean the effects of events that happen not just here in the States, but also overseas where we come from. And the types of psychological shockwaves that those send to us, even though we're here on the other side of the world. And then there is societal and institutional discrimination. So this occurs when there are practices, policies, or norms of a social institution that negatively impact us as Arabs or Arab Americans. So an example of this could be the USA Patriot Act, which, when that came out, it opened up the door to a lot more surveillance of Arab Americans. An example of this could be bans on immigration from people from certain countries. So we have these various forms of trauma and these ways of breaking them up into different categories because it helps us give them a name. It opens up the door for us to explore them in more detail. And it also gives us an opportunity to see how they may be relevant in our own lives, opening up this door to be able to talk about them in a way that makes more sense to us as individuals. And before I pass it off to Khadija, who will delve deeper into one particular form of trauma, I just want to mention that experiencing trauma, like if anyone listening has related to some of these different experiences, experiencing trauma does not automatically mean that we're traumatized. There's a big difference. So again, one could experience trauma but not be traumatized. However, it's at the same time, it's very important to recognize if one has gotten so used to particular forms of trauma that they start to feel normal, we might be carrying this trauma within us without even recognizing it anymore. So again, Khadija will speak more about the topic of trauma on the following slides.
Marhaba, it's such an honor to be with all of you today, and thank you to Naeem. And I also just want to thank Abid and Besma also for moderating this. So just to start out with, I'll start by defining what intergenerational trauma is. So it's often interchangeably used with the word transgenerational trauma. And so if we break down the word itself, trans is transmission and generational through generations. So it's transmitted when a trauma is experienced in one person in one generation, and that trauma then goes unattended and it remains unresolved, which then gets passed down to the next generation. As the presentation goes on, I just want you to take notice of what arises within you. And, this is such a heavy topic, and I would like for you to give yourself permission to allow what comes up. Trauma is oftentimes stored in the body. And so it affects just our minds, our hearts, our bodies, and our spirits. And so when I think and talk about sort of these 4 quadrants, I want you to think about it in the lens as your mind being the place that holds your thoughts and your beliefs and your judgments, your heart being sort of the portal that holds your emotions, the body being the container that holds your somatic and physiological sensations, and your spirit being the space in which it can either create connection or disconnection for both oneself and other individuals that are around you. And so as we move forward with the content, I just want you to pay attention to some of the thoughts that are coming up and what emotions you're experiencing, and if any of your body parts start to experience any tension or change. Oftentimes in Western or Eurocentric models, we only consider intellect and the mind as being the highest intelligence, and we often dismiss all of the other intelligences. And so I invite you to be part of the decolonial process in inviting back in all of these other intelligences that I mentioned and utilizing these sensations to inform you of what other processes internally might be occurring. And so how does all this intergenerational trauma things happen? There are so many reasons why trauma remains unresolved. And, the first reason that I'll name is that family members might not even know that they have trauma if trauma language has never been part of their language base. And so this really speaks to having a lack of access to education and resources that help explain what trauma is and the implications of what's happening in our family systems. In families, this can also mean that trauma has been normalized to such an extent that it's become part of a lived experience. So someone may not even realize that there's something that needs to be attended to. And in Western society, there is such a dependence on the medical model. And so if family members feel trauma in the way that it manifests physiologically, which oftentimes it does, their first notion is to go to like traditional medical doctors and to go to practitioners and to run a battery of tests. And so when that happens and when everything comes back negative, they may not even know that there needs to be further investigation, and that might be where everything sort of ends. And so this also speaks to the lack of mental health education and the overall stigma of mental health, in which Naneem had mentioned. And so therefore it just leads to the dismissal of psychological symptoms in our entire community. And so when that happens, again, the trauma itself goes unattended, it is unchallenged, and then it gets passed down to the next generation. And so trauma itself results in behaving in specific ways in an attempt to cope and to develop some of these survival mechanisms. And so the coping techniques then get passed down to children, which then gets passed down to their grandchildren, and then further into the lineage and to the family tree. And so, I talk about it in the context first as family, but I also want to create the understanding that outside of the family, that then it becomes extended into communities. And outside of that, we can also have full communities that are in states of trauma and may not even know it. And so I do want to highlight and talk a little bit about a pioneer in the field, Resmaa Menakem, who discusses historical trauma. And I have highlighted and written a quote, which I think is a really beautiful way to capture the essence of what unattended trauma looks like over time. And so I'll read it to you. And he states that trauma decontextualized in a person looks like a personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family traits. Family in a people looks like culture. Over time, people think they are defective rather than something happened and continues to happen to them. And so I think this is such an important note when we're discussing the Arab American community, as continuous oppression, racial discrimination keeps occurring. I'll discuss this further in length as the presentation goes on, but this factor in and of itself contributes to the way that we show up in our daily lives and how we utilize coping and survival skills and understanding our identity in spaces that are largely white dominated and centered. And I want you to remember that as this presentation goes on, the central notion that we are not defective and something keeps happening to us. And so our coping mechanisms and survival techniques that show up are protective factors. And so remembering that, these are sometimes involuntary, or they are learned experiences, rather than it being as a form of like shame and guilt based on the processes that are coming out. And if we move to the next slide, I'll share a little bit about how this comes to be. And so there are two major ways that trauma gets passed down, and they both work hand in hand. And their nature and their nurture. And I'll start off by talking a little bit about nature. And nature refers to the biological component of our gene expression. There's a fairly new field of research, and there's still a lot of research that's coming out that's called epigenetics. And it helps explain how our genes are re-expressed through the chemicals that flow through our bodies. And so it doesn't actually physically change our DNA, but it changes the way that our body reads the DNA sequence. And so with intervention, it can actually be reversible, and we can again change the DNA sequence in a way that our body interprets it in a more healthy manner. But when we become highly stressed, our nervous system enters into a state of fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so these are generally involuntary responses when the body is experiencing either a real threat or what we perceive to be a threat. And so for individuals that are living in states of trauma because of the marginalized communities we come from, oftentimes we do have a large generalized perception of what perceived threats will look like. And so the response is made in an attempt to keep a person safe and to return back to a state of neutrality. And so for those who aren't familiar with the processes of the nervous system and fight, flight, and freeze, I'll tell you a little bit about how they show up behaviorally. And I want you to think about, even for yourself, what defense mechanism tends to come up the most for you. And when you're in states where there are real or perceived threats, what happens generally in your own disposition. And so fight refers to kind of facing the perceived threat head on. It can look like confrontation, or it can look like aggression. Flight is pretty much the opposite of that, where it refers to running away from the danger or trying to escape it as quickly as possible. And freeze is the inability to move or to act against the threat. And so this can look like either a complete collapse, or it can look like just being in a frozen state. And so sometimes you'll also hear clinicians talk about a fourth modality that comes up, which is something that's called fawn. And fawn is defined as an attempt to try to please the threat in order to try to diffuse or to avoid the conflict itself. And so in all of these responses to thwart off danger, stress hormones are being carried through the body and being carried through the bloodstream. And the most notable one is cortisol. And so if cortisol is chronically flowing through the bloodstream, our gene expression can be modified, and it can then become the phenotype of the genetic marker that shows up in utero. So the cortisol levels can become transmitted from a mother into utero, or it can also genetically be passed from a father and his sperm. And so what that really means is that it results in a baby that's growing in a womb that may not necessarily feel safe or neutral. They can experience hyperarousal and stimulation through the felt secretions of stress hormones. So prior than ever entering into the world within itself, it's already predisposed into a space that's already experiencing hyperarousal and already a feeling of a level of unsafety. And so, switching on the other hand of nature is something that we refer to as nurture, which is the social and environmental factors. And so, this first begins happening in caregivers and in children. And it's done interpersonally, meaning through one person to the other. And it's often comprised of behavioral patterns. So traumatized caregivers express their suffering in very specific ways, and the child then picks up on those trauma responses. And so there are three major aspects and ways that this shows up. The first is when a caregiver is disengaged or irritable, and the child aligns then with the caregiver's behavior. So you can almost think about this in the way of the child turning into like a mini version or like a mini parent. And the second way that this occurs is when a child tries to overcompensate for the parent's behavior by overworking for their parent's validation or trying to attempt to be perfect. And so, the thought process behind this is if I can be perfect, mom or dad or whoever my primary caregiver is, doesn't have to be so stressed. So then if I can alleviate some of that burden, maybe behaviorally it'll change, how they're feeling or the way that they're interacting with me. And so, as this goes on in time, this is also make a child turn to overachieving or using what's called parentification, which is a role reversal in which a child then takes the role of being a parent, or actually does start parenting the caregiver and holding space for them and being able to work in the ways that a parent traditionally should hold space for children themselves. And so I want you to remember again that this isn't said to be in a space of judging parents, because I do truly believe that everyone is doing the best they can through learned experiences. And so if they're not aware of the defense mechanisms and the behaviors that are showing up, they also aren't going to be able to draw an awareness of being able to shift that behavior into a more healthy dynamic that helps to change the family communication patterns. And so the third major way that this shows up is when patterns that the caregiver elicits creates attachment related patterns through either abuse or neglect. And so behaviorally, that can also show up as the child grows up in the way that of how much they can endure in relationships when they're trying to seek validation or to even try to keep the peace. On the other end of that continuum, it can also look like isolation or, mistrust and withdrawal. And this is very generalized to speaking into intergenerational trauma, but also specifically with Arab Americans. And, the next slide, if we can start moving to that, I will speak about the differences specifically in Palestine and Palestinian diaspora. And so, as I said, we spoke a little bit about intergenerational trauma, and now I want to shift towards talking about historical trauma and the way that it shows up and its implications within us. So as Renee mentioned a little bit before, historical trauma results from systems as part of being in a specific group that's undergone genocide or collective oppression that's based on a marginalized identity. And so for Palestinians, the largest event that we can name is the Nakba, which is known as the Great Catastrophe. Following that, we can include the 1967 Six-Day War and the intifadas that have followed that. And so I say this to say that, oftentimes you'll hear about these very big events that happen. And I want to note the importance of saying that this is not episodic. Like, this is not one episode. This is very structural, and it continues to take place in the form of settler colonial violence and continued erasure, both in Palestine and in the diaspora. And so when we're talking specifically about Palestine, I want to, reference and name a Palestinian psychiatrist and clinician, Dr. Samah Jabed, who names the fact that the inflictions on Palestinians do not fit the standard categorization of PTSD. And the reason so is because there is no post. Palestinians are living under occupation and apartheid, and the daily settler colonial violence affects every aspect of their being. And so for those who are not familiar with PTSD, it stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I'll share a little bit about it. And it starts to develop as a response to a traumatic event. And symptoms have to persist for over 30 days for it to meet a qualification and to meet diagnosis. And so some key symptoms are having flashbacks, bad dreams, avoiding thoughts and feelings that are related to the event, or staying away from places, events, or people that are reminders of that. And so behaviorally, that can look like consistently staying in spaces of hyperarousal, of being tense or having difficulty sleeping. And so the mood shifts into spaces in which there's constant anger outbursts that exist. And so it affects both cognition of your thoughts and also your emotional and mood regulation. And so a traumatized person can actually have a lot of difficulty remembering not only the event itself, but also a lot of the information that surrounds that, both prior to that and even after that experience. And so it is very easy for someone who has experienced or is experiencing PTSD to internalize guilt and feeling blame, and to also develop a worldview where they view negativity not only within themselves, but the outside world is also viewed in a very negative light. And so, there is a distinction made with children as well as adults. And for children, that really affects them developmentally in a way in which they start to regress. And oftentimes for children, that'll show up in a way in which they start to forget how to speak, or they actually regress in ways in which they're unable to speak, in addition to clinging more closely to their attachment figures of their parents, and also having a lot of physiological symptoms that show up, such as bedwetting. And so, I have some statistics that I'd like to share, and specifically to Palestine. A lot of these studies were done in Gaza, but some of them have been generalized in Palestine as a whole. And so the Norwegian Refugee Council report that was released in 2020 reports that 68% of Palestinian school children have psychological distress, and 24 of them have completed suicide in 2020. I want to note that it's important to state that like suicidal ideation has overall just increased into, such high percentages. And so even if there is no intention or plan, it is very concerning of how much the depression and the suicidal ideation has increased, not only because of the settler colonial violence and the apartheid, but also talking about the references of COVID and the ways that that's affected, the Palestinian communities. There was also a research study that was conducted in 2020 on children and adolescents in the Gaza Strip by Khudri and his colleagues. And it reports that 88.4% of children and adolescents have experienced personal trauma. 83.7% have witnessed trauma to others, and 88.3% also have observed demolition of their property. And so, not only are there challenges in mental health in general, but something that is important to note is the challenges that are faced by mental health clinicians who are trying to aid in the process. And so mental health clinicians and services are very limited, and they face a series of challenges. There's an excellent book that just came out recently, and it was written by Lotta Sheeha and her partner, Stephen Sheeha, which is called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. And so she really talks about Palestinian clinicians who are working under Israeli supervision. And she notes how Palestinians are oftentimes misdiagnosed and often seen as delusional and taken out of treatment early based on what Israeli supervisors deem as satisfactory for Palestinian clients. Palestinian clinicians are also expected to perform their oral licensing exams in Hebrew, and they make the process of them getting licensed so much more difficult. So this already adds to the pre-existing condition of how much disconnect in access there is for mental health services. And so, it is important to note and to remember that as Palestinians who are living in diaspora, settler colonial and, the occupation itself is a disorder. In Palestine, I can't reiterate this enough when I say that settler colonialism and the occupation is the disorder. And so rather than pathologizing the individual and looking at someone like what is wrong with this person, I want us to shift our language to let's look at what is happening to this person. And so we can understand and to look at the framework of it as the system itself is diseased, not the individual. And so, as we shift from Palestine into diaspora, I want to name and to highlight, a lot of what typically comes up in this language, which is that we do have the privileges of not living under occupation. And so, with that said, the trauma that's experienced in diaspora is still very pervasive, and it affects every area of our lives. And so oftentimes this creates a minimization of our experiences. This really sounds like, and I'm sure all of us have heard it from our parents and even other members of our family, it's like we have to be so grateful. We must be grateful because we don't have it as bad as they do. And while that's true, right? So we aren't living under occupation. We aren't living under settler colonialism in the way that they are. I think oftentimes that can create and be helpful with perspective, but it also leads to the invalidation of our experiences, and it doesn't allow us room to be able to grieve. And so we continue to face racial trauma in diaspora. This oftentimes leads to places of consistently feeling like we're out of place, and holding on to either being too much or not enough, especially in Western society. And, living in the diaspora, we're always holding on to the pain of not being in our homeland. And, even members who are living in diaspora are exiled and don't even have the opportunity or the privileges to return back, even to visit. And so we're always made to feel like we're too much in Western society. Another aspect of that is also the continued exposure to the brutalization of our people through TV and social media. And this also increases vicarious, or what we refer to as secondary trauma. This is further harmful when we continue to be ethnically cleansed and denied in even being able to use the name Palestinian. Consistently watching and being able to see the brutalization of our people is not normal. And we must kind of resist the normalization of continuously seeing individuals that are coming from our communities consistently, have harm being perpetuated onto them. And so there's a fear of consequences also of activism, and there are very real consequences to that do exist. This occurs in the ways that our speech is oftentimes policed, the way that we're shadow banned on social media, and the silencing of our efforts by consistently having, the narratives and the tropes of like being labeled as anti-Semitic if we're actually speaking out on Israel's atrocities. And so what happens is oftentimes we start to cope by trying to conform to white Western ideology. This really includes, a lot of examples of shifting our language, being able to look at spaces and to say, like, how many times have we shifted and even corrected parents to be like, no, speak in English, like, remove the Arabic language out of that. And, utilizing nicknames to sort of support white comfort. I can guarantee you every single person in this room knows at least 5 Mo's, and every single Mo, it comes from like a different root word. Like, we're talking Mobeen, Mohammed, like all of that. But I'm sure all of us know all of the Mo's that exist. And I'll kind of shift into the next space and have, Naneem talk a little bit about some of the narratives that are existing in Palestine versus diaspora.
Yeah, thank you, Khadija, for passing it off. Wonderful description of intergenerational trauma and the differences between and among Arabs and Arab Americans. So this slide, building on what Khadija mentioned, it's through stories of Palestinians in the diaspora. And I pulled them from this wonderful book called Being Palestinian. Highly recommend it. It's a collection of short personal reflections of Palestinians in the diaspora, over 100 of them, all of whom live outside of their ancestral homelands. So I understand that we've shared a lot of information with you so far. So rather than me reading out all of this, you have the choice to read it to yourselves if you wish, or for those who would like to take a little mental break and sit with a lot of what we've shared so far, we'll take a couple minutes to do that for now. All right, so we can, hopefully you all had a chance to either read or take a moment to sit with all that we've shared. We can continue on to the next slide. We'll be talking about resilience and healing. So in American psychology, resilience is often defined in 2 different parts. And so it's the presence of some type of adversity or trauma, and then our ability to cope with the trauma and adapt as necessary. In reflecting on this definition of resilience, it makes it sound like an individual action that each of us has to take on, when it really doesn't need to be understood in that way. Developing a sense of resilience, yeah, it could be through our personal actions and individual efforts, but it can also happen collectively, as a group, as a community, in the ways that already fit within the ways that we know how to move through our lives within our culture. So what I'm proposing is that we think about resilience differently. there are many things that we already do that fit within our culture that we know nourish the quality of our lives. And through those activities, we can develop a sense of resilience in the face of adversities. And developing resilience can be seen as more of a side effect of the things that we already know are helpful for us. So it's looking at resilience and the different activities we engage in, not as a means to develop more resilience, but rather to do the things that we already value as a community, and not as a chore, but rather as something that is important to us. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about some research that was done among Arab Americans to determine where they found strength and resilience in their lives, what was important to them. So here are several of the areas that they identified, many of which overlap with one another. And I'll touch on most of them, and the ones I don't touch on we'll come back to in the following slides. So first is the importance of family. For us as Arab Americans, and all of the support we give to one another within our family systems, that can really help us be strong in the face of adversity, or adapt in the face of adversity together with the people important to us. Middle Eastern and North African values. That could be something like generosity, hospitality, the importance of education. So hospitality, surely many of us are familiar with the experience of going to a family member or close friend's home, being given shay or ahwi, not because we want it, but just because it's just mandatory. We're given shay or ahwi because that's just what comes along with the visits. And when the food comes out, it's like seconds, forget about it. Seconds are coming, and once you start to have a choice of whether you'll take more is maybe on the third dish. So it's this sense of hospitality. I say it in a humorous way, but it's this caring for one another, building these communities together around food, around the experience of food, and these visits with people close to us that help create this sense of community, which is a central theme to a lot of these different categories. So religion was also identified as very helpful. And that could be religion through the different religious practices. That could be the traditions that communities of people come together to engage in. It could also be the guidance or the aid, or help aid us in our ability to make sense and meaning of our experiences, whether they're day-to-day experiences or related to areas of trauma. Friends and neighbors. Again, this comes back to the community that we have around us and the importance of community in our lived experience. Other folks identified social services. So this could mean healthcare, this could mean public education, the funding for different projects, like funding that PACC has been receiving to put on these wonderful events. School. A lot of folks identified school as something that contributes to their sense of resilience, and that could be because it helps an individual grow and develop themselves, and where each one of us wants to go in the future. And for those of us where school is not an option, helping the next generation continue on and take a sense of control in what happens next for them. Standing up for oneself. So that could look like challenging stereotypes, pursuing better opportunities and options for ourselves. And by doing so, by standing up for ourselves, this gives us a sense of power and confidence in ourselves and our abilities. Emotional coping and support. This could be in personal approaches like journaling, like connecting with others, like reflecting personally on our different emotional experiences. It could also look like talking to a counselor, an Arab American counselor, whatever that might look like for the person. And then we have collectivistic ideals. So collectivistic as opposite to individualistic. So giving the group that we belong to priority rather than the individual wants and needs that we might have. So in our context, this could look like the importance of family and community in the decisions that we make in our lives and where we find value. And again, that it builds this sense of cohesion with the other people that we care about around us, with the people that are important to us and that we're important to them as well. And then last, I'll mention a little bit about finding meaning in adversity, finding meaning in these different experiences of trauma. This could be through religion or through community or through the different readings. This could also be through therapy or persevering in the face of challenges. And while that happens outside of us and it might be out of our control, the different traumas, I mean, making meaning out of adversity means taking back that control and how we sit with and react to the experience. After a period of grieving a certain type of trauma, this could mean recognizing that we might have more compassion, more empathy for people going through similar experiences. This could inform the career path we choose or the religious path we take. These different experiences that happened, we have an opportunity to create something beautiful out of it in the different ways that we're inspired to give a sense of meaning to the experience. So that could mean giving us the strength to be advocates for ourselves or for the people we care about. That could give us the strength to be advocates for other people who are discriminated against or experience different types of trauma. It could really inform the way we move through the world in different ways, in a way that is within our control, within our power. With that, we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so, resilience and healing can be done, as Denny mentioned, on a collective level, but it can also be done individually. So I'll touch base on both of those aspects. And so, as I mentioned before, trauma is stored in the body, and so we must address it through all processes. And so this includes movement in order to release some of the trauma and also to help reduce the cortisol levels that are running through our body. And so some of these examples can look like physical exercise. It can look like dance. Shout out to PACC having DEFCA lessons. Yoga, stretching, acupuncture, and also cupping are just some examples that can be really helpful. And so, decolonizing our methods of healing. As I said before, Western society really, really, really hones and centralizes the idea that the mind is the most important intelligence. And so I think as part of being able to reclaim our own identities, we have to understand that collectivism plays such a large role in that, and our value system does as well. And so what I mean by collectivism, I'm not just specifically referring to family and the people that are around you. I'm also talking about our relationship to land. As Palestinians or even as Arab Americans, when we think about that, most of the time our land is being taken away from us. So what does that look like? By re-engaging in ways that help to be able to reclaim and to help heal us within that self. And also outside of relationship with the land, I think utilizing healing practices that have been passed down to us. A few things that come to mind to me is thinking about music. As I grew up, I would oftentimes, sit with family members and I would listen to the oud being played. And I would listen and kind of hear, I can't think of the name of it right now, but the little flute that they consistently play, or the tabla. And, parts of that is I even notice that my nervous system, when I'm sitting around it and I hear someone else playing it, it immediately brings me, yep, there you go. Thank you, Nanya. And so, as I think about that and as I sit, I can even notice that my own body starts to calm down. And so I want you to tune into the intelligences that have been passed down through us, and also even herbs and the ways that traditionally they've been passed down. And two that come to mind to me is, baboonage and metamia and, sage. And so drinking some of those and even thinking about that through the lens of growing up and through our own ancestors and having that passed down can also really create sort of a holistic lens of addressing, again, both mind, heart, body and spirit. And so as I talk, and you hear me constantly saying about connection to ancestors. And so remembering that our ancestors passed down such wisdom and resilience to us as well. And so connecting to us, we can actually really truly challenge, and channel their level of strength and connection to either spiritual or religious beliefs as well. So, therapy, really normalizing therapy. And as Nadim talked about, even in the beginning, starting to break some of the stigma and working individually to process our own unique experiences. There is so much that we hold on to and that we experience. And there's so much trauma and there's so much grief. And it's okay to have a space to be able to talk about that and to continuously work towards improving our well-being. There are many things and factors that we don't have control of, but a thing that we do have control of is having the ability to break our own generational patterns within the frameworks of our family. And this can really happen by holding up a mirror to the dysfunction in your own family and seeing how you're carrying those patterns on and how you're upholding them in your own life. And so I talked a little bit about, awareness to somatic body responses. And this just really talks more so to mind-body connection and recognizing again what rooms you're stepping into that create a sense of comfort and almost disarms you like you're taking a jacket off, and which rooms you're walking into and you can feel like you can cut the tension with a knife. Starting to pay attention to some of those experiences, because oftentimes physiologically that will look like your jaw being really clenched and grinding your teeth when you're sleeping, or constantly having tension headaches. And so your mind is telling you stories, and you have to just be open enough to start to befriend them in a way that you can use them as information. This also looks like self-regulation and being able to find small habits that can create impacting change over time. And so some of those can even look like just being able to breathe and pause and focusing or sort of anchoring yourself on something in the room that helps to bring you a sense of peace. And research shows us that if you spend just 5 minutes of breathing in belly breathing, it can actually turn on the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation response. And so that within itself, if you condition yourself to just setting like say 2 or 3 random alarms on your phone, which is 15 minutes a day. And when the alarm goes off and spending 5 minutes of breathing, this can really help shift you out of a place of autopilot and just spend the time to be able to ground yourself in a way that your body will over time really start to thank you for, and shift into a place of retraining yourself into a way that promotes more relaxation. And so, like I said, those are some of the daily rituals that exist. And something else that I would really recommend is limiting consumption of news and social media, especially close to bedtime. And I'm talking to every single one of our Ammos out there, because they are straight up right next to Al Jazeera right now, 24/7, and they have their coffee in one hand, and there's no reason that they should be doing this at midnight. So take a step back, take a step back and be able to understand the limitations, because externally, even if that isn't something that feels like it's being affected, as we sort of shift back and understand it unconsciously, our body is always keeping the score of that. And so we can shift into the last slide. And I know we have just a few minutes left, so I'll run through that pretty quickly. And this talks a little bit more about shifting into a community space, which Nadim had touched on. And so storytelling is something that is so innate in our cultures, and is such an important source of healing and resilience. And I want to talk just a little bit about a study that came out by Delgard and colleagues, and it really centered on Arab American families, and they talked about Palestinian families as well. And it speaks about the conspiracy of silence and how it affects Palestinian families. And so the results show that when they're trying to shield and hide children from talking about trauma narratives and what's happened before in the past, it can actually really promote poor mental health, and that growth and resilience is really possible when family narratives are framed in empowering ways. And so this can really help children integrate not only their ethnic identity, but also their individual identities. And so when we're discussing historical traumas such as the Nakba and even the ongoing violence, it's important to utilize 2 aspects, which is fact, and to be able to understand and put into context what's happening, but also the understanding of the emotions and the emotionality that is being brought to, that comes up as a parent talks about it. And so disclosure and open family communication really helps to promote mental well-being, not only in children, but it can also help as a resilience factor in the adults that are sharing this information. And so, something to really keep in mind is also when we are discussing it with family members, it's meeting them where they're at. right? Not overwhelming them with this information. And especially when we're talking to children, making sure that they have the psychological readiness to be able to absorb some of this information. So making sure that developmentally it is something that is appropriate. And, of course, that can always evolve in time in the way that these conversations evolve in time. And so, outside of storytelling, connecting with culture also really helps to reclaim our identity and increase pride in our lineage. And, as Naneem mentioned, today we're already doing this. We're having these conversations, and PACC just had a PACC Day, which was such a wonderful way to celebrate identity. And the last thing that I'll talk about is a way of increasing healing is to find ways to promote activism on a level that feels empowering to you. Oftentimes, we become so overwhelmed that it can help shift us into a place of learned helplessness. Like, what are we supposed to do because this thing feels like it's never going to end? And so I encourage you to shift in a way that helps to empower yourself. And some of those can look like just having a conversation and opening up space for a family member to talk about their narrative. That's activism. It doesn't always have to look like the framework of being on front lines. It can look like just engaging in one or two places. Activism can look like allowing yourself to be able to, push back on the colonial structure of urgency and give yourself the space to just be able to process and give yourself a space to be able to breathe. And so, as we shift into discussion, I just want you to even think about some of the things that have, come up for you and what's resonated and what aspects of those felt surprising. And we can shift right over into discussion if you feel good about that.
Yeah, so thank you, Khadija. I'm still in awe. Like, this was such a wonderful discussion to have, and we actually do have quite a few questions in the chat. And we have the discussion questions as well. So let's see. So I'm gonna just start. I'll start going through from before, and then we can kind of shift back and forth. So one question was, this was asked anonymously. I'll just read it. Do you have any advice about how we can have these conversations with our parents without them getting defensive and thinking that we're blaming them or saying it's their fault?
So something that comes up for me immediately is, this conversation is being recorded. Show it to them, right? So having a conversation where you're sitting down and being like, whoa, like, let's look at all of this and help me unpack that with you, right? So not necessarily probing them in a way that, again, meeting them where they are. If mental health is something that is incredibly new to them, that can look like continuous conversations. That can look like sort of storytelling and just starting off with saying, can you tell me a little bit about like what it felt like for you to go through this specific event, and seeing even if they're open to talking about that, or even drawing an awareness to some of the trauma, techniques that I talked about that tend to show up behaviorally, like curiously leaning in to your parents and being like, which way do they show up and how they shown up in your life? That can tell you a lot about sort of the state in which they're in. And so some of that can even, like I said, utilizing this conversation and walking into a space and being like, I learned all these different things. I'm wondering if you ever thought about it, or what you think. And so just starting to have those conversations, I think, can be a great opening. And also, like I said, kind of meeting it with a place of non-judgment, because I truly believe oftentimes our parents are truly doing the best they can without having the access or the resources that we've been entitled to sort of in our generation. And so, those are just a few things that come to mind.
And I also have some thoughts about this question as well. It kind of building on what you mentioned, Khadija. Immediately, I think of the rules of dialogue. So some of the rules that come along with having a dialogue, avoiding telling a person how they should be or how they should do something different, and rather speaking from one's own personal experience, speaking about how one feels or how one thinks about a particular topic, rather than what the other could be doing differently. And to build on that, including also, how the decisions that have led to us being where we are, or the discussions that come up, there's a positive component to some of the topics too, like the decision to move to the States could be a topic of conversation, and how it's not just filled with negative points of conversation, but there are a lot of positives that came in that decision too. So they don't feel that that they're being blamed for anything in particular, but that it's something that's just simply experienced together among the family.
Thank you so much. Another question we have is, in our community, we are noticing many more family issues that are breaking apart families that are definitely rooted in the concept of intergenerational trauma. How do we work with families to, one, recognize the bigger picture, and two, actively work to end this negative cycle? And actually, just I want to add for my own question, that's something similar that Khadija, you mentioned more than once, that our families are trying, they're doing the best that they can, so we can't really blame them. So how can we work with them instead?
Naeem, do you want to take this, or do you want me to add my thoughts on it?
I have some thoughts, but I'm kind of like processing all of it because it's a big question. It's a great question. I'll just start some of the initial thoughts that come to mind. Placing the blame where it belongs, and that is on the occupation, on the physical, emotional, spiritual violence against our communities, and seeing that is where the blame is to be placed, rather than on our reactions to some of these experiences, because we all react to these events in different ways, and the blame belongs with the violence against us, not within the family system oftentimes. And there are outliers to that, but that's just the first thought that comes to mind, is really asking the question, what is the reason that we're having this problem? What is the reason that there is this conflict? And is it external to us? Should the blame be placed elsewhere?
Yeah, I love that, Aneem, and I was having similar thoughts. And something that I do want to note and kind of mention is that, I did discuss a lot about being able to offer a certain level of self-compassion and meeting, family members where they are. But something I do really want to note that I think is incredibly important is that also looks like meeting them where they are, but that doesn't mean that it gives them an all access pass to treat other family members in any way that they want to. So boundaries are so important too. And, that can be a whole topic within itself in the way that boundaries show up in Arab American communities. But I think it's important to name that and to say that when I say things like that, I'm saying that outside of the topics of abuse and neglect and, psychological harm in that way. I'm talking about family systems in which, it looks like, for example, when we're talking about these situations, short of a shutdown response or being able to not necessarily access parts of themselves as a result of their own survival mechanisms and needing to shut down. So I just wanted to, and I thought it was really important just to make that distinction, that when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about abuse or sort of like, more on the severity of psychological harm. And so, aspects of that, like, I agree, like I said, with everything that Naneem said, but within the family unit, parts of that is possibly even finding the safe spaces that exist. Maybe not going to the most challenging individuals in your family and feeling like you have to start there, right? Maybe that looks like going to one of your aunts or your siblings and starting to have some of these conversations in a way that's like, where's my opening? And so where can I even create safety and allyship in the framework of my family? And that might not be in my immediate family. And so if I can have someone else think about it through the lens of even culturally, oftentimes when there are big issues, they're bringing in other members of the family and they're bigger discussions, and this should be no different. It's like, how can I find someone who could be an ally in this experience? How can I build safety with them? And to start to do that, and then little by little inviting in more and more individuals who can then possibly say, if there is one specific person or a parent who is experiencing a lot of these behaviors and it can be really damaging, you can also have the support to be able to do that in a way that isn't inflicting harm on either party in that space. So I hope that was helpful.
Yes, very. Thank you so much. So now I think it's a great time to switch over to the discussion. So for participants, we have some questions for you all to answer, and we'd really love for you to go ahead and answer in the chat, and we can get a conversation going. Or I think we'll be okay if anyone wants to even unmute and participate. So first, yeah, I know there were some questions, but does anyone have any other questions about the content that was discussed? I know for me, it was just a lot of like light bulb moments. Like, yes, now that makes sense. All right, thank you, Rania. So how does toxic masculinity fit into this?
Raneem knows I'm so passionate about this, but I'm going to throw this at Raneem.
Toxic masculinity. I think in a lot of these conversations, when we talk about this kind of builds on a little bit of what you mentioned before, Khadija, where toxic masculinity. I think I need another moment to reflect on this. I've got lots of thoughts and they're scattered around at the moment. So Khadija, you have thoughts as well?
I sure do. I'll jump right in. No, I'm just
Oh,
kidding.
perfect.
So, you know, how does toxic masculinity show up in our communities? And I think oftentimes we can see this, and in gender roles, we can see this in the way that we show up. And so, you know, that can really look through generations as a way of serving as barriers, especially I think for daughters and women in the Arab American community, to shift towards these spaces. And I think part of that is being able to, you know, not only advocate for oneself, but also to find safe spaces and being able to push back on that. I want you to remember that also we're talking about systems. So rather than looking at individuals, the larger system of this being patriarchy, the larger system of this being about the roles of what masculinity looks like. You know, oftentimes in Arab countries, if we even look at it through the Western framework, you know, masculinity is defined in a way that's like, let's shut down emotion. Let's shut down and you know, repress and suppress everything of that experience because I must show up in this very specific way. You know, my masculinity is threatened if I'm around, you know, say a strong person who challenges me, who might be of the opposite gender or what that might look like. And so understand that, again, these are all pieces of societal scripts that have been internalized. And so part of that experience is being able to unlearn that and being able to work through that both individually and as a community of saying, you know, how have we not only affected ourselves, because when we talk about it through the lens of trauma, this furthers trauma. If we're shutting down these emotions, not talking about these emotions, and being able to shift in a lens that prioritizes sort of stoicism externally, how does that help us heal? Right? It has a function, and we can understand where the function is coming from, and we can appreciate that oftentimes that where it's been developed from came from a place of survival. But I think it's so important to start to eradicate some of these symptoms within the framework of our community in a way in which we can all show up for one another, and help family systems, because this also shows up in the way that we parent children differently. You know, this also looks like the way of gender roles, and, you know, and a lot of that framework creates internal conflict within marriages. And so I think, you know, as a whole, toxic masculinity plays such a large role within the framework of not only society and in our families. And that's something that I think is going to take some time to be able to unravel and to dismantle a bit.
And to build on that, the toxic masculinity, and it as it relates to the way we talk about mental health, this way of thinking about what we value as a culture, I think is very much influenced by this patriarchal system of valuing the things that are important to the men in the community. And that could be this sense of this, push to be strong, to be stoic, as you mentioned, Khadija. And that creates a lot more distance between us as a community and being able to address these different forms of trauma in our own lives, to have these types of conversations, talk about them, to heal and to build from them. And so I think toxic masculinity, in the way that it takes what might be more important to a certain group of people in the community and makes that the norm across the whole, that is really inhibiting our ability as a community to move forward and heal from a lot of the struggles, and continue to build more community and more spaces of healing together. I think that's where one example of where toxic masculinity arises in this whole conversation.
Thank you both so much. So I'm just looking, there were a lot of comments on this next point, but I wanted to ask if anyone wanted to respond. Which aspects of this presentation stood out to you? We had a lot of comments on this. Just trying to see. I'll go ahead and ask because I have one. Something that really stood out is just that you both spoke on how we see, I guess, like manifesting how our families do cope with the trauma in ways that we may not, at least our generation, may not have recognized. For us, I think we're learning to be more comfortable with therapy and seeking counseling and speaking to someone, whereas with the generation before us, it could look very different. So having those, like, as I am, like for me, I'm like, oh, now I'll appreciate the as I am and not be annoyed so much by them. So another, like, just to connect to some comments, a lot from Reverend Fad is seeing a lot of that, the question of getting our parents involved in this. So parents hearing this. So I guess we could, maybe if we could speak to this a little more, just that generation of those who can't speak about it, but may address it in their own ways.
I think the first thing that stands out, and this is a statement that Khadija's mentioned a few times now, is meeting them where they're at. And that doesn't necessarily mean adjusting our whole conversation around where they stand currently, but rather just meeting them there and hoping and working towards helping them kind of come along to understanding in the way that it makes sense to us as people. And it's a great question, how do we bring this up to the parents? And I think that's the first place to start, and weaving it into the things that parents are already involved in. So if there are conversations about food and making meals, and if there's something relevant to like where a particular meal came from, or the topic of maybe like, oh, this meal is really good from this particular region, and I wonder about the history of this particular region. It's just finding these ways into the conversation that do not automatically like rip the parents away from where they're standing currently, and helping kind of ease them into the topic. That could be, like Khadija mentioned, like seeing this recording and what the thoughts could be on that. Yeah, I think it's not going to be something that happens overnight. it'll very likely be a more gradual process as people open up to these topics.
Thank you. We have a few new comments. Something I just saw Victoria mention. She said, I think in conversations of trauma, it's easy to fall into deficit-based language. So I really love how much this knowledge was presented from strength, wisdom, and the beauty of Palestinian culture, families, and communities. So she says, thank you. And then Rania did say, I think the whole concept of intergenerational trauma, it really explains a lot of things on a personal level. So sometimes putting a name on something you're experiencing is a huge help. And I personally absolutely agree, Rania. Like for me, I think it was just being seen and recognized through this discussion is helping and healing in and of itself. So I'm just going through the chats. There's actually a question if we want to pause on discussing and answer. Nadia, I'm going to just ask, can you touch on the burnout that often comes along with activism and organizing and ways to cope or practice self-care?
Do you want me to start with me? You can kind of jump in. So, burnout is such a real phenomenon, especially in organizing and activism spaces. And I think if we're especially referring to it through the lens of the last few years, we're talking also adding on the collective trauma and all of those other aspects, which I think can really increase burnout and kind of compassion fatigue as a result of it. And so, to kind of answer your question directly, ways of being able to cope or practice self-care is a very individual and again a community process. And so I would encourage you to look at the forms of activism that you're engaging in and sort of organizing and seeing what parts of them feel the most draining to you and what parts of them feel the most energizing. So being able to look at the work itself and recognize and see like, what makes me feel like I just got hit by a Mack truck after I do it versus what part of it feels like they're really coming from spaces of ways that I'm able to show up present versus showing up in like, robotic ways and just kind of going through it. And another aspect of that is seeing the level of burnout in which you're in, right? Because sometimes we can talk about rest through the lens of I need more sleep. And sometimes rest can look like soul peace, like my soul needs peace. And so I encourage you to, one, limit consumption of like news, limit consumption of social media and stimulation in general. Getting into the habit of allowing yourself to go into spaces that help to shift out of that and give you some time to be able to ground yourself. Grounding is so big in being able to help resist and push back on burnout, in addition to engaging in things that really help bring joy in. And being able to, start off small by even incorporating, like I said, breath practices. That can really help stimulate and to turn on the relaxation response in the brain, because every single time you're sort of engaging in activism work, it's also opening an arena for vulnerability. And so the stress cycle has to be addressed after every single one of those pieces. And so that might look like taking 5 minutes, like I said, to either breathe or engaging in exercise to just reduce the cortisol levels versus it being brought back into a space of the body. And just asking yourself where your own safe spaces are. Do you have individuals to unpack that with? This really hard work. It's important work and it's incredible work, but it's really difficult work. And so are you an individual who's just giving out, giving out, giving out? And can we look at your cup and to say, how can my cup be filled? How can I maintain and to create, places and outlets which can pour back into me. So therefore I can then go back out and do some of this work. And also knowing your own limitations, knowing, that sometimes it's more so about being able to not put more things on your plate once you become energized, but pushing back on sort of the idea that you're always having to be productive, always pushing back on sort of this idea and this framework and, the colonial framework of like self-worth is equated to productivity. And so pushing back on some of those pieces, and I think, questioning and looking at what your level of activism looks like, and having the definition of activism over time be flexible and being able to change, and for that to look also different as well. And so those are just some thoughts that come to mind right away.
I have a thought as well on this topic, and that's the way in which we view activism and self-care and the relationship between the two. So we might often think, we're doing this activist work, and when we do want to take a break, when we do engage in self-care, there might be a little voice in the back of our mind saying like, oh, we should be doing this or we should be doing that. There's this event going on. And what I'm proposing is that we think of activism and self-care as a lot more united than separate from one another. So when we think of activism, seeing self-care as a part of our activist work, if we're constantly going, we might not have any more energy to put out good work, to put out our genuine activist selves into the community and into the work that we do. And so to take care of ourselves, knowing that that's what's going to give us that energy, give us that strength to keep doing this work in the future. And one idea, when that thought comes up of, well, I should be doing this, I should be doing the other thing while one's engaging in self-care work, reminding oneself of all the things that they have done in that world of activism, so that you could feel like you're allowed to give yourself a break. And in doing so, that is a part of activist work.
That's a really good reminder. Thank you both. I'm here to jump in because so much of what you said just resonated. We do want to be a bit mindful of time. I know you had one more discussion question, but what we're going to do instead actually is for everyone who's interested in continuing this conversation, and this was something that Khadija and Janeem and I and Rania spoke about when we first were planning this, is wanting to give you all a space after this, after today, to continue having this conversation. So I'm putting a link in the chat, and this is something that PACC is going to be kind of working on with Raneem and Khadija, hopefully, if there's enough interest. If any of you want to continue these conversations, feel like there's more that you want to unpack, I just put a link to a form where you can sign up, and I didn't know what to call it. I was joking about calling it like a trauma bonding group, but I don't want to center it on trauma. So we're just going to call it a working group. For anyone who any of this resonated with, I'm going to be signing up for this because I have so many questions and thoughts. Please fill out the form, and then we will get in touch with you to continue this, because we can't talk about this in just an hour and a half, right? And we want to give people more time. So if there is more interest, if you want to continue these conversations, please fill out the form, and then we'll be getting back to you and getting in touch with you to figure out how to do this in the best way. So Basma, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Abir. I opened it immediately, actually, so I could sign up. It looks like we need to change permission, but thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your presence, and thank you so much, Raneem and Khadija. I think this was an eye-opening conversation, and I look forward to continuing it as well. I want to sincerely thank Mona and Bassem Hishma for sponsoring our conference and for always being incredible supporters of PACC. And I'm going to just leave off with a fun trivia question for everyone. So the first person to answer correctly will get a free conference t-shirt. The form is in the chat. You can go ahead and answer your question and win. And I think Abir did just update that Google Doc. So thank you so much, everyone. This concludes today's session. Tomorrow we have one more day. It's going to be starting at 11 a.m. So we look forward to seeing everyone. And thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It's been such an honor to be with you. And so I thank you so much for sharing your space and time and energy with me today and with Naneem.
Yeah, this has been a treat to connect with you all, and I'm just really appreciative that a lot of what we had to share resonated with a bunch of folks, and we hope to continue doing this type of work in the future. And for anyone interested in connecting with us, with Khadija or I, We could share our emails in the chat as well for anyone who would like to connect afterwards.
That'd be awesome. Thank you for offering that. And also please fill out the working group form. If it's hard to get on the chat, we'll email it to you all also, and we can put it in the WhatsApp group. But I also just want to thank, on behalf of PACC, just thank you both again, Khadija and Naneem. And I want to thank Basma for doing such a great job moderating this. And when Rania and I were talking, we're like, Basma is going to be the perfect person for this. So thank you for doing this. And thank you all for joining us on your Saturday morning and afternoon. And again, we do have one last day tomorrow. So we hope we see you all there. Bye, everyone.